أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الندوة من تنظيم.
So welcome again, dear colleagues from Syria, in front of the screen, whether you are inside or outside. It is too far, and we are very tired, sick and tired of all of the atrocities taking place in our country without anyone taking or paying attention to the Syrian blood. We are tired of fragmentation and diaspora. After 3 years of the political process beginning, and after 5 years of the resolution 2454, it is the time right now to say our saying, or to say our opinion as Syrians. And after our homes were destroyed, and after we were displaced, and after the infrastructure of our country was devastated, and after our military has been devastated, and after we were fragmented, and we are no longer one people, and we are polarized. This forum is nothing but an attempt to actually vocalize the Syrian voice. And I would like to thank Karama, who have helped us to organize this forum and or seminar or webinar, and we will try to vocalize our concerns. Maybe we will not be able to change our destiny, but at least we will try. I would like to thank everyone who are participating with us. Right now, we have 47 participants. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much for your trust in us. I'm still receiving messages of people who are trying to join the webinar and cannot yet. Right now, I will give the floor to Ms. Heba Qutman to deliver her opening remarks.
Okay. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all here today as we discuss what now for the UN-led process for Syria. I'm delighted to say that we have a truly outstanding panel to consider what has been one of the most difficult and tragic situations facing the world today. It is also the first discussion to be hosted by Sandiana Institute, a new initiative of Karama for dialogue. Sindiana aims to develop closer understanding between national and international decision makers and the people affected by their decisions. We are now 20 years on from Security Council Resolution 1325, and peace processes are still close to women and close to the wider community. So Sandiana Institute aims to open these processes to ensure that people on the ground are able to understand, influence, and contribute to what is going on at the national and international levels by bringing them together with the decision makers. It's extremely important to understand this is to open up the discussions that are taking place in Geneva, New York, London, Washington, and Paris. Everyone cannot be in these places, and everyone is not invited to the table. And a lot of people, and all these meetings end up with men who are making decisions on people's lives, and usually it's just a bargain who's going to be taking this and that. So I think the whole idea of Sindiana is that we will open up that. We will invite ordinary people, academics, activists, decision makers, international governments that are the international community that's involved with this peace agreements, work with people like Mona and the community to see exactly what they want in that peace. Peace is usually, it hasn't worked. Everything that has been done has not worked yet. So hopefully there will be a lot of times people are curious, what are in these agreements, and who is really making the decision. So I think this will be what we are attempting to do, is to open up that dialogue and bring those who are in Geneva and in Washington or Moscow or Tehran to really come and talk to the people and have discussion and hear from ordinary people that are affected every day by this disaster to influence that process. That's one. Two, we are absolutely a non participant for anybody. We are absolutely open to everyone. And we just want to close that gap. And I just want everyone to know this is a woman-led initiative. And I'm very happy everyone is here. I would like on that note to hand this over to Muna Ghanem. Muna, as you know, she doesn't need any introduction. She's with her community. But for those who are are new to Mona, especially the internationals, Mona is an activist, an academic, a doctor, a medical doctor, a politician, and a great woman who really loves her people and her country. And I would like to hand it over and again thank everyone who has chosen to be with us today. Thank you. Mona, I hand it over to you.
Okay. I will start with دكتور عمار. سنبدأ مع دكتور عمار. دكتور عمار هو
So I shall start with Dr. Ammar. Dr. Ammar is an engineer and he is an expert on oil and gas and also international organizations in Syria, and he has worked for a very long time as a consultant in London. And after that, and of course, he established several organizations, a think tank in Syria, as well as a media organization. Dr. Ammar, I would like to ask you a question, two questions, in fact, one personal and another political question. The personal question, you represent yourself as against the revolution, and that you represent the opinion of those Syrians who were against the revolution. Today, there is no revolution or uprising. How were those who were against the revolution identify themselves today? Because there's no two parties today. There's only one party, which is the Syrian regime. And of course, the official opposition is not there anymore. I'm not speaking about the opposers because they are still there. Another political question, in your opinion, the Syrian authority had declared their uh, their victory in the political process, but they are still going to Geneva, but they are not doing the political reforms or the changes that they claim to agree with. So they can actually implement these changes in cooperation with the coalition countries, especially that there are strong coalition countries like Iran and Russia. But if the Syrian regime or the authority is not really sincere about participating, then why do they go to Geneva? Do they have another agenda? Go ahead, please. We cannot hear you. Hello again to all of you. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity for allowing me the opportunity to present my ideas. Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to Hibaq and Karama. In the beginning, or first of all, on a personal level, what I can claim to represent is not the opinion of the Syrians who are against the uprising or the revolution, because the concept of the uprising is not understood by everyone. Of course, there was a movement that started in 2011, and this movement, in the perspectives of those who started it, has different concepts. Of course, not everyone who took to the street had the same objectives, and those who did not want to take it to the streets were against it, and they resisted, and they also encouraged the others to avoid it. And also, those do not have consensus on it. They have different perspectives of this uprising or the movement. If we focus on those who claim to be against the revolution or the uprising, they can be categorized into different classes. Some of them looked at this movement in the main project. Some people took to the street for purely progressive objectives. And let us agree that there were not many. But there are other people who took to the streets for other purposes. And this is the prevalent ID or identity in Syria. And they identified themselves as freedom seekers, just like some of the people in the United States right now who think that they are not represented or their voices are not heard. So this is the right wing. Some people were against it and they were afraid of this movement, and they consider it to be threatening of their interest. There's also movement, the rural community against the urban community, and they felt that there is a class disaggregation, and they felt that they were deprived of their rights. Some people, which started very small but turned into a very strong movement or current, especially the Salafi movement or the Salafi ideology. But this ideology or this movement is not known for democracy. But there is the middle class, of course, and all of this can be, we can add to all of this the risk averse, those who expect the worst case scenario. If they do not see the end of the tunnel, then they would be reluctant to take any further steps. So all of those were against what is called the uprising. I believe that it is wrong and it's futile also to consider those who were against this movement. And most of the projects are people who hate democracy or hate transparency in ruling or the good governance. I believe that these values everyone share, but what were behind those demands were different ideas. So we are facing a Syrian divide. A part of the Syrians have interest in implementing this project, and there are other Syrians who found it in their interest to actually resist this movement by clinging to the current authority, because toppling the current authority or the regime means the collapse of the economy or the currency, and then any change would be worse than the status quo. So these people still have similar perspectives, and we can call them the Assad constituency, or the group in support of the President Bashar al-Assad. Those people are still there, and they have been since the beginning, especially the risk-averse category. And today, after all of this, all of the all of the hardships today, and all of the economic collapse, still believe in the same idea, meaning that the removal of the state means the collapse of the whole state, or the removal of the regime means the collapse of the state. So they have only one perspective, which is clinging to this current regime, which is better than void. And of course, I eliminated many of the other things, like the perspective of the cooperation with foreign forces. My second question is, why do they go to Geneva? Why the Syrian regime is going to Geneva if they are not convinced? In my opinion, the Syrian regime, and the problem that we are facing is that when we look at the mutual consent or Geneva Declaration, it is perceived as dialogue or discussion or negotiations between counterparts. One part, or the opposition on the other part, is the regime or the state. But I believe that this perspective is flawed or false. I believe that the main objective is to achieve agreement or consensus among the Syrian people, and it is not the Syrian regime going to Geneva to have discussion. This is continuous because there is no other alternative. Even if the Syrian regime or state was victorious in its war and have taken back control of all of the Syrian territories, there are some people who will feel foreigners, people who were cast out of Syria, and they will never return. So these people should have the opportunity to return, and they should have a better hope, as opposed to the deception that NATO armies or forces will come and they will topple the current regime and the opposition will take over. This is like a dream, or it's like a deception. So those people who are outside of Syria, will they remain outside of the participation forever? We need to bring them back. So if there is no mechanism of agreement between those and the other Syrians who are against the uprising, then we will not have a solution. Maybe the state or the regime, their participation is an attempt to bring Syrians together. This is the suggested way forward. Of course, the Syrian regime is not actually a party as they perceive themselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Amar. Right now, I would like to give the floor to the special envoy to the British special envoy to Syria, Mr. Jonathan. Floor is yours.
Mr. Jenison.
Yes, hi.
Many thanks. And I'm very sorry to be joining this conversation late after my struggle with Zoom. And I also see that I have a nice picture of my parish church in the snow behind me, which I'm not sure is ideal. But thank you very much indeed for allowing me to participate in this extremely important meeting. And on such an important topic. And of course, the timing of this conversation could not be more appropriate after the meeting last week, where I think we have all come away thinking about what is the future for this process. And I can only echo the remarks of UN Special Envoy Pedersen regarding the outcome of last week's talks. It would be it's clear that last week's talks did not lead to the kind of outcomes that we would have hoped to, either in terms of content or in terms of giving momentum to this process, despite really quite modest expectations for future meetings. So this is a very timely conversation to say what next. From the point of view of the UK government, of course, we remain absolutely committed to making progress on Resolution 2254 and finding ways to make a reality of it and give it more momentum and more forceful purpose. And so we are very much in the business of trying to find what could be the ways to open up this dialogue and to make it more meaningful. And of course, there are other baskets within 2254 as well, which are of great interest, including the extremely important issues of detainees and prisoners and of elections in the future, which we're also keen to try and support in any meaningful way. But I think rightly, one of the focuses for this meeting is, of course, on the role of women in the process. And from our point of view, that's an enormously welcome and important dimension to this, which I think we feel we may be able to shine some light on and together to move forward on. I think my perception is that there are so many things going on in Syria at the moment, and women in particular are facing so many day-to-day difficulties just to survive and to make it to the next thing, that the idea of being involved in what may seem a rather distant political process must be extremely difficult for many, many women in Syria. And yet, I think we have for rather a long time got in the habit of thinking of many Syrian people, and perhaps Syrian women in particular, as only being victims in this conflict, which of course they are, but they are also the future, and they're also the hopeful future for Syria. So when we see a survey, as we have recently, that says that only 5 out of 200 women surveyed have heard about the Constitutional Committee, this makes us think, what is the distance between these formal processes and the many people for whom this is ultimately their future and the future of Syria? So it's absolutely crucial that women, who of course make up at least 50% of the population and by definition at least 50% of the future of Syria, are much more meaningfully involved in this process. And I'd be really interested to hear from this conversation how people think that that might be possible. We as the UK government have been trying to do some modest support to women's role in the political process and to supporting women to build a peaceful future in Syria. We support the work of the Women's Advisory Board, of course, in the Constitutional Committee. And we'd love to see the participation of women in the Constitutional Committee increased from the currently very modest 27% where it is at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of this conversation to hear all of your ideas. And it's a great privilege to be amongst such illustrious company. To hear what ideas we have for continuing to press with Resolution 2254, but in a way which is even more meaningful for many Syrian people and for Syrian women in particular. And to see whether there is a way that you think that the international community, and amongst them the United Kingdom, could support that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your present. I know that you are new in the post, so we really appreciate your participating with us, and we will make sure to send you all the recommendation we have from this webinar. Now هلا معنا الدكتورة سميرة مبيض. الدكتورة سميرة مبيض.
Right now we have Dr. Samira Mbaid. Dr. Samira Mbaid is an academic researcher in she is a previous faculty member in Damascus University. She is a representative of the civil society bloc in the Constitutional Committee, and she is also a writer and a political activist, a civil activist as well. Welcome, Dr. Samira. My question for you is, 5 years since the issuance of the resolution 2254 and 2 envoys for this resolution at least. And we see in the most recent session, which is a 5th session, that there is a failure and also frustration by all Syrians that no progress has been made, not only in the Constitutional Committee, but also in the resolution itself in general. And we understand that one of the most important pillars of this resolution is actually an official and a recognized political opposition. But we saw how the political opposition was struggling, and many of them went to complain against the others in Moscow, and some of them took some measures and steps in Saudi Arabia. It is unfortunate that one of the main pillars of this resolution is in a case of fragmentation. So what is the civil society betting on in participating in this process? And also we see that the political groups in the north eastern of Syria are not actually represented in this resolution. So is this resolution say implicitly that Syria will not include that part of the Syrian geography? It is true that there are some figures represented there, but the main political forces are not actually represented in this resolution. And it might be understood by some people that this is a call for implicit cutting of a part of Syria. Thank you very much, Dr. Muna. Thank you very much for Karama for organizing this webinar. As you said, the opposition is in a state of fragmentation, a high level of divide, and this divide is attributed to ideological divides within this opposition and also the different opposition blocks. But also it is one form of one form of being subsidiary to different forces. But we have been supporting a radical change in Syria, and of course this requires movement by civil society as well as the political currents, but mainly by the community and the society at large, in addition to what we will say later, the constitutional process. I will start to address the question regarding the resolution 2254. Of course, all of us know that the resolution, after 5 years of issuing or forming this resolution within the UN Security Council uh, circles. And of course, this resolution is very important and it includes many very important points. One of which, and for mostly, that it gives priority to the solution in Syria under international platform for issuing the resolution. However, also one of the points under the resolution, they are focusing on a non-sectarian government, and also focusing on in uh, elections, fair and free elections. Of I believe that this could help many Syrians to overcome their concerns about the ambiguous future of Syria. However, this resolution also has many also disadvantages, which I will mention, meaning that this resolution is not binding. First of all, we are seeing a case of expressions that are not binding, including Article 10, 12, and 13 within this resolution. And of course, these say that the resolution calls upon the parties to or it applies pressure on the regime as well as the opposition to implement the articles, but it also calls for allowing the humanitarian aid or relief to be delivered to the Syrian people, which were not delivered properly over the past 5 years. But it also calling for, and without being binding, it calls upon ceasing weaponization and ceasing any military operations. Of course, with the absence of a binding resolution, unfortunately, after 5 years, no articles have been implemented. Also, one of the disadvantages of this resolution is that the relevant parties are the representatives of the Syrian government and the opposition, meaning that all of the other categories of the Syrian people who are not associated or affiliated with any political parties, and we know that the vast majority of people are not affiliated with any political parties currently, and also due to the absence of proper political work in Syria for about half a century, this means that we have a complete exclusion of all of those who are outside of the conflicting parties, who are in a situation of strong polarization. So these categories of Syrian people find themselves outside of influence in the political transition. The third disadvantage, and the final one, is the lack of implementing any of the articles of the resolution since 2015. In addition to that, we have many developments in the power dynamics in Syria over the past 5 years that are not being taken into account within the respective resolution. The questions that you are asking within this webinar regarding resolution 2254, but also there should be questions about the need for a new path or a new track. Any political decision that could be taken would entail a number of potential risks, but also there are potential gains. The potential risks is to have a regression of the political transition or achieving this radical change in Syria, which is, of course, a vital demand and a main demand for the continuity of Syria and the Syrian people after 50 years or half a century of a totalitarian regime, and of course, destruction of the political and the cultural life. And of course, this is one of the potential risks, which is regression or the continuation of non implementation. There are many resolutions within the UN circles that haven't been implemented for decades, and also the lack of binding resolutions. But potential gains is to make a progress by implementing immediately a resolution that would ensure the best interests of the people away from any ideological polarization. Of course, within this resolution, it is not relevant to the reality, and there needs to be relevance with the reality. And also, there is a waste of time when this is at the expense of the Syrian people. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Lujain is actually a graduate of fine arts from Damascus University, and she is the editor-in-chief of Rosanna magazine, which is located in Paris, and she is also a head of a UN project under UN Women. She was awarded 7 different awards for supporting women and refugees specifically, and she is also specialized in gender-sensitive journalism in 6 countries around the world and in the region. My question for you, Lujane, right now I'm very interested in feminist issues, and I saw something similar to the women participation when I read a book about the other gender, meaning that we create a political process and then we engage women, or we establish a resolution and then at the end of it we mention women. I am often accused by many people that I am uh, an extremist, an extreme feminist, or in terms of my position to the resolution 2254. Tell us, however, what is the situation of the feminist movement in the political process, and how can we improve the effect of women participation within the community? Thank you very much, Doctor, and thank you very much for Karama for organizing this session, and thank you very much for all the participants. We have great participants, and we thank them very much for their interest in this webinar. Of course, the resolution was not only hasn't only failed in finding a political solution in Syria, but also has failed to engage women in the political process, whether in the Syrian dialogue or in the uh, and thank you very much, Dr. Samira from the Constitutional Committee. Of course, there was a flaw from the drafting of this resolution, which encourages women participation in the political process without emphasizing on the women quota that should be represented, whether on the level of the sub groups or in the Constitutional Committee. Although that there is often emphasis on women participation. This resolution, of course, also allows the intervention or the interference by Turkey and Russia and China, and there was a mission that these countries that fall within the list of countries that do not take into consideration gender in the political empowerment. So this will not be supportive of women presence in this process. There's also another point. They used de-escalation, and they used it in order to establish their influence in the different territories, which uh, had undermined the women liberties and rights in these territories, in addition to the lack of any political solution for this a very long period of time since the issuance of this resolution, which also undermined the roles of the local societies that were supportive of women. Today, there are many people who live under the poverty line, and of course, this will continue unless there is an actual political solution. Such a political solution will lead automatically, or the lack of such a solution, many girls will have to drop out of school because many people are given priority to males in education. Also, there will be degradation of reproductive health, and of course, one of the also today with the COVID-19 pandemic, there is also a huge change in the affected categories by the pandemic, and primarily women are affected due to the change in the roles of women because they have become the breadwinners and also the caregivers inside homes. Also, the lack of any information regarding or gender disaggregated information about those affected by the pandemic, and also the lack of the ability to reach out to the women affected by the pandemic. All of this is not included. Of course, there are two men to head the committee, and all of those who speak about the results are males. There were no women. So whether the work will be within this resolution or regarding any new solution, it should include having an independent gender bloc that should have weight in writing this constitution and finding a political resolution that will ensure the interests of women.
الدكتور خالد بيطار هو اقتصادي وخبير في شؤون المجتمع المدني، عمل فترات طويله مع الاسكوا ومع اليو ان دي بي، وهو مختص في شؤون العمل المنظمات، عمل كثيرا، دعم كثيرا من المنظمات السوريه، حاليا مقيم في المانيا ويحضر للدكتوراه في العلوم السياسيه. دكتور خالد، أنا بعرف إنه أنت محضر برزنتيشن عن الدروس المستفادة بالعمل المجتمع المدني، بس أنا الحقيقة شفت على صفحتك كثير من الحدة تجاه دور المجتمع المدني والاتهامات، يعني أنت اتهمت المجتمع المدني بأنه
Also on your page, a lot of attacks against civil society, and you say that they are not really sincere, and it is nothing but the other face of the opposition and the regime. So you can tell us the lessons learned, but how can we improve the work of the civil society instead of criticizing the civil society? And is there an actual civil society in Syria? And are those organizations in diaspora that are actually accused of receiving foreign funding, are they actually independent in addition to the other organizations that were established internally under uh, the monitoring of the regime? Are they actually independent, or do they have to report back to Damascus? So is there an actual civil society in Syria? And if yes, how can we improve its performance in the political process in Syria? Thank you very much, Dr. Muna. I am very happy to be with you here today in this webinar. I believe that this is a very important webinar and a timely one, especially after some of the leaks or the news about one of the rounds or the session by the Constitution Committee. I have actually created a PowerPoint presentation, the concept of civil society and what is happening in Syria. Before going to Germany in 2018, I was still working with ESQA, UN ESQA, and I have prepared a white paper which I submitted to ESQA, and it was also submitted to the special envoy of the UN at the time. He was de Mistura, about the importance of civil society organization participation in the Geneva track and the importance of engaging civil society in the political process as well as in dialogue. We needed to convince the people about the participation of civil society. Also, in this presentation, I spoke about this. I believe you will find the answers within my presentation. You have 5 minutes, sir. You already spent half a minute. Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible. Next slide, please. When we speak about negotiations, let us ask ourselves a couple of questions. We don't have to answer them. The question is, are there clear parties to this conflict? Is the opposition an actual party? Is there a mutual interest by all of the parties in the political track in Geneva? Is there a mutual interest in stepping out of the impasse? Is the international committee supportive? These are very important questions that we need to ask before we think about any mechanism of building peace. Next slide, please.
2017 عملت كمان بإحدى
In 2017, also in one of the conferences, I tried to compare between the different peace tracks in Syria. So I actually compared between two different tracks, Geneva and Astana, and I tried to see how do they affect each other before I addressed the issue of civil society. And of course, I here presented two possible scenarios if the two political tracks go hand in hand or go along, then we can have maybe a positive results. The Astana track was trying to deal with the armed conflict parties more than the security issues. And if Astana track progresses and the Geneva track regresses, then there could be a passive peace. There could be peace in many areas, but while the clashes remain in some of the areas. But if Astana regresses and Geneva progresses, then there will be uh, uh, clashes or military clashes in the majority of areas. But right now we are entering the black hole. Next slide, please. Civil society. Once we try to think about the civil society should be ideologically and politically unbiased. That is based on the people authority. Uh, Civil society is not organizations. Organizations are nothing but representatives of civil society or a result of the civil society development. The legal framework or environment that governs civil society are three things in Syria. First of all, the constitution. Secondly, the associations law, and then the judiciary. The environment that we need to work on in order to empower civil society and to have a healthy and an effective civil society, the laws need to be based on the constitution, also supporting the personal liberties and facilitating work in the north. There are three generations of civil society that we can actually categorize to see who is participating in the constitutional committee and the peace building. There is the generation which is the charity one, and then there is the developmental generation which provides developmental services. The third generation works on the policies and tries to pressure the government and society in order to make the changes. Of course, civil society values uh, tolerance, integrity, independence, good governance, and responsibility. Next slide. Peace building. What we are saying today here in Syria, we are calling it a peace process. But is it a peace building or a peace maintenance? Even the United Nations is actually confused between three different concepts in terms of implementing the peace process in Syria. If we are talking about peacekeeping, then there should be forces that would separate two conflicting parties and would cease fire. But with peace building, which is the United Nations is following the Astana track and all of the other countries sponsoring the peace process, they try to bring together two parties in order to reach an agreement to be signed, or the peace building, which is placing a peace environment instead of the war environment. Next slide, please. The third point, which we need to focus on to learn the importance of civil society, let us talk about the social capital. There are three types: the bonding, the bonding social capital, the bridging social capital, and the linking social capital. The bonding social capital is actually bonds people in relationships. People would be within homogeneous groups. Let's say the Roman Orthodox group. This is a homogeneous group, or the Muslims. They have an association and they have an agreement. This is called the local community or civil community. The bridging social capital, which is the most important, is the one that links two different groups that are not homogeneous. And then we have the linking social capital, which regulates the relationships between the base and the top of the pyramid. And this is, of course, in brief, this is a relationship between the authority and the people. Next slide, please. So the social capital within all three forms, the bonding, the linking, and the bridging, are very important factors for producing a stable political system, provided that the authority is able to actually respond to the social changes. Next slide, please. You still have 30 seconds. Just give me an additional minute. From the civil society perspective, through my career, they were trying to find a role for civil society in the peace process, meaning, first of all, to amend the relevant laws, for example, the laws of the professional associations and the associations. And of course, this needs to be separated from the executive behavior. And of course, also to correct the behavior of the executive authority, which is antagonistic of civil society. And of course, this should include amendment regarding the freedom to associate and also the independence. And next slide, please. Civil society found that they should play the role of the observer and the monitoring also, and also participating in discussions, and also offering or presenting relevant topics, and also suggesting relevant solutions. This is what they were focusing on. This is prior to engaging in Geneva track. Next slide, please. They were suggesting that there should be representation of the three generations, and there should be a balance. If these are organizations working inside the areas controlled by the opposition or the areas controlled by the regime. And of course, they were focusing on having quantitative representation. Next slide, please. Next slide. They were concerned about a number of issues, and of course, all of the concerns, I saw them from the beginning, from the Geneva track until now, which is engaging the civil society in the process. The concern was that the civil work will be politicized and polarized, and they were also concerned that civil society will not be representative of the Syrian people. Today, the civil society does not actually represent the people, but they wanted to the civil society to represent the interests of the people. Is it or not? And also, the Syrian authority at the time, as well as the opposition, were not welcoming of civil society in the beginning. I believe it will be the last slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. The civil society chamber, the special envoy perspective, what did he do? He said in a paper that was distributed to all of the civil society chamber, Q&As about the role of the civil society chamber. Of course, he said that it represents a wide range of Syrian opinions. So he is giving the representative capacity to civil society, which is wrong. The special envoy is determining who should participate and not. No, there was no body established that is capable of achieving consensus to participate in Geneva track to select who should participate and not participate. And of course, civil society was actually also eliminated from the negotiations track. So civil society is either prior to the negotiations or after. They are actually separated from the parties. Next slide, please. We spoke about this, the Constitutional Committee, and that there is a severe polarization. All of the concerns that the civil society was afraid of happened actually. There was a strong polarization. Also, there was an absence of leadership in civil society. They couldn't even assign a spokesperson. There were always disagreements, and they got engaged in actually um, in arguments, and we saw what happened with the Geneva Declaration. Last slide. I promise you these are the references. Uh, Thank you very much. We should have started with the last one. Next one, please. Next slide, please.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We should have started with the last slide because we are very interested right now in learning from this experience. Everything I'm very sure that the civil society wanted to make changes in Syria. However, the mechanism on which it was based was designed to actually produce this polarization and this kind of outcomes, because the structure or the composition and also the attempts of some figures and some parties to actually replace the Syrians and to lead the process, while the resolution says Syrians or this political process should be led by Syrians. This is very important for us to remember as Syrians. It is true that our country, there are five different countries that have military bases in our country, and we are very weak at this moment. However, we need to remember that the people who do not seek their dignity and their renaissance will get nothing. We accepted to give leadership to the United Nations collectively, not individually. But if all of us refuses to have the United Nations as the leader, and if we can have a Syrian approach to allow women and civil society to participate, I believe that results would have been better. Finally, I will introduce Dr. Sami Al-Khaimi. He is the father of Syrians. He is the one who is worthy of this title. He's the one who tried to vocalize the concerns of the Syrians. Dr. Sami Al-Khaimi is well known. He needs no introduction. How he is an electronic engineer. He is a graduate from the American University from Lebanon, and he has worked as a teacher and a designer, and also the developer of several computer systems that were implemented. The most important thing is that he was the Syrian ambassador in London in the beginning of the incidents in Syria, or the uprising. Right now, he is the founder of the Syrian group of independent experts, which I have the honor of being affiliated to, that is trying to vocalize the concerns of Syrians and to deliver their voices and to step out of the circle of polarization. My question for you, Doctor, your approach says the political solution in Syria should be away from polarization, the regime and the opposition, because the percentage of those who represent the opposition and the official government is nothing as opposed to the remaining percentage of the Syrian people. However, the resolution does not talk about the presence of the Syrian people. So don't you think that expanding the space to bring in Syrian figures is completely in conflict of the resolution 2254, and that we need a new mechanism to deliver the voices of the Syrians? In your opinion, don't you think that our objectives can only be achieved through the representation of all Syrians? Thank you very much, Dr. Mona. Thank you very much for inviting me. Do you hear me? You are completely right. To hear the voices of the Syrians, the Syrian opinion need to be respected. We need to be classified within the civilized world. Unfortunately, we are still perceived uh, as in the bottom between or by the advanced West or the developing East Asian world, who are still in the bottom of that list. So therefore, this needs we need to be included in the global order. Let's go back to the problem of the Constitutional Committee, which does not represent the interests of the people, but rather the interests of the two conflicting parties with internal fragmentation and divide. As usual, the and as we all know, 90% of the Syrian people do not prefer, are not in favor of the Syrian regime, and 90% of the Syrian people are not also in favor of the official opposition. However, today, if we hold 100% free and fair elections in Syria, we will find that 50% will be voting for the regime and 50% will be with the opposition. Why? Because 40% of them, they prefer the regime over the disastrous opposition, and the other 40% prefer the opposition over the regime. And therefore, the Syrian people will be divided, even though that they are not represented, even if the election is free and fair. This, of course, prompts whenever we are forming a representation of the Syrian people, that we need to resort to to appointment. We cannot, in a destroyed nation, we cannot bring people and to tell them, come on, let's have a conference. Let us have a national conference or Congress to decide, because we will have a severe divide between two categories of society. The solution usually here is to resort to the mothers and the fathers, the founders, meaning we need those to establish the headlines for the country to be restored or rebuilt. When the Constitutional Committee was formed, it was formed in a manner to keep the Syrians in the hands of the interfering countries. And therefore, any decision made by this committee is reliant on the international agreement. Those interfering countries, they do not have any interest in pushing forward the political solution, but rather seizing or freezing the military operations. The the strongest forces in the region, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, are actually acting as they are regretful at the expense of Syrian people. And no Arab solution was made to solve this problem. The severe economic crisis which the country is suffering today hasn't changed the positions of the conflicting parties, but rather it will only lead to more exclusion of the people, and it will push people to migrate or to establish an economic solution that relies on exporting drugs or maybe uh, or foreign fighters. Today, I think that the situation will continue until the conflicting parties and the foreign interference to get sick and tired of the destruction. It might end within 10 or 15 years, or it might not end forever. And if it doesn't end, we need to rebuild the country from scratch. Now, after this very grim picture, let us look for solutions. Solutions can be underpinned on two main foundations. The first foundation or base is to start national reconciliation and to have a political agreement that is comprehensive, that covers governance, the rule of law. The second pillar is an agreement between the Americans and the Russians, who are actually uh, governing the whole world with the leadership of the United States until now. They need to agree on a new UN resolution that would allow forming a new constitutional committee that represents the Syrian people and not the interest of the other countries or the interests of the conflicting parties, and also to establish an association of mothers and fathers, the founders that represent the conscience of the Syrian people, and also to establish a military council. And this is a new initiative to establish a military council, a professional one, to assist this uh, assembly, as we call it. So this is in general. If you would like me to enter into the details, I'm willing if I have time, Dr. Muna. Let us continue to speak right now because we will have Q&As. We have also a representative from the autonomous administration. Mr. Luqman Ahmi, is he here? If you are here, please write for us in order to send you the speaker's link. Mr. Luqman.
Okay.
I thought he was with us. Mr. Luqman, welcome. If you could turn on your camera, please. Mr. Luqman. Mr. Luqman. Okay. Welcome. I would like to introduce Mr. Luqman. He is the spokesperson on behalf of the Autonomous Administration. Welcome. We wanted to bring representatives of the whole Syria, but we wanted to bring representatives of the Autonomous Administration in this webinar specifically because they are not included in the UN resolution. My question is for you, Mr. Luqman. What are the challenges that you see in this resolution? First of all, as a Syrian, and secondly, as a Kurdish. I want you to speak from both capacities because there are general difficulties for Syrians and specific challenges for you as a region. Go ahead, please. We cannot hear you. Your microphone is muted.
الو
Go ahead, please. Good afternoon to all of you, or good evening. I'm sorry for being late, but there were technical difficulties that hindered me from participating from the beginning. Of course, the resolution 2254, we believe, is the most important one and towards a solution in Syria. However, there were some obstacles in the face of its implementation because many countries tried to turn this resolution in their favor. The resolution was issued at the end of 2015, and everyone knows that at the end of 2015, the situation of the Syrian regime was very poor in terms of its military forces and also its coalitions. The Russian interference was still in the beginning. All of this prompted Russia to accept such a resolution. However, the time period that was established for this resolution is what allowed Russia and the Syrian regime, through the Russian military intervention, to actually flip the table in favor of the Syrian regime. And of course, they did not comply with the time periods included in the resolution. That's why we believe that if we look at the resolution 2254, and before we enter into the articles, in the beginning it says the objective is to bring in the largest or the widest category of opposition that will be selected by the Syrian people, and they would establish their negotiation positions. I heard the doctor, of course, are those engaged in the negotiations in Geneva represent all the Syrian people? Any unbiased observer would see that those who are participating in Geneva do not represent all the Syrian people, especially if we take into account the areas of the Eastern Euphrates. More than a quarter of the population do still live there. So Resolution 2254 with the articles therein is which is still the resolution through which the Syrian crisis can be solved. However, when we look at the first article of this resolution, it says that the Syrian people will be the ones deciding the future of Syria. But we look at the outcomes of this resolution. Is it really the Syrian people are? Is it really now the Syrian people who is negotiating in Geneva, or is it only the two conflicting parties who are negotiating their interest and negotiating authority or power? So, as a Syrian, I believe it is possible to re-operationalize this resolution again if the international will is unified. We understand that international resolutions, if there is no consensus on it by all the international parties, then one party can actually hinder it. Today, this resolution is hindered due to the support by Russia to the Syrian regime, and also because when the Syrian regime, and even at its worst time ever at the end of 2015, they did not want to make any changes in Syria at the level of the regime or solving many of the other issues, including the identities or the economy or the politics. The majority of the social issues that Syria was suffering. So the Syrian regime does not have the will, and also the opposition. And when we say it in the first article, it says that a political transition that should be associated. We haven't seen any. We haven't seen any political transition and no other associated measures and no uh, uh, trust building measures. So therefore, this resolution wa was was actually analyzed by Mr. de Mistura into four different measures, and but everyone knows that in lack of a political solution, no force can actually establish a Syrian constitution. However, if there is a political consensus and consensus on political transition in Syria, any group can at least formulate a democratic constitution that recognizes the rights of everyone, and then we would have solved the problem. But the opinion of the autonomous administration, we say that Mr. de Mistura have put the Arabs in front of the horse. So with this arrangement, Resolution 2254 cannot see the light of day if we take into consideration the other point, which is that the people negotiating in Geneva do not represent all categories of the Syrian society. And also, as a Kurdish person, from my perspective, no one in Geneva represents the Kurdish cause or the Kurdish interest or concerns, even though that there are some figures with their identity are actually Kurdish, but they do not represent the interests or the concerns of the Kurds. So we believe that the best solution for Syria is for Syrians to get together, and those who believe in a democratic solution would get together and to establish a platform in Syria, because relying on other countries would not achieve a solution for Syria. Over a decade, for over a decade, the Syrians have seen if they are not unified, and if they do not have consensus, or if they are not on one platform, and without having a democracy that actually recognizes all of its components, including the ethnic components and also the religious components, then they would continue to stand at the doors of countries begging for assistance and relief and support and all of the other things that Syrians have seen. And Syrians will continue to be IDPs and refugees and victims. Uh, no one knows what their destiny is. In order to avoid all of these hardships, we always call for a Syrian dialogue, because countries, they have their own interests. And as I said, that in 2015 the situation was different and Russia accepted the resolution. But after the situation changed, Russia started putting hurdles in front of this uh, resolution. So only the Syrians who have the willingness to establish a peaceful and a political resolution need to establish a a pluralized democratic system, plural in terms of ethnicity, national identity, and religion. If they believe in all of this, then they can establish a solution. Otherwise, the crisis will continue. Many of the countries have interest in a continued conflict. There are other countries that are benefiting from the Syrian displacement. Let's give you examples. There were countries who were receiving Syrians and calling them guests, but today they are receiving money against their against the Syrian refugees. Thank you very much, Doctor. Sorry, I have to interrupt you because the time is very restrained. There will be a Q&A session. Today we have about 78 participants, the majority of whom are from inside of Syria. We insisted on this. We wanted people from inside Syria to participate in this webinar. And as I said, as Syrians, we miss each other. We miss being together. We miss living in dignity. We miss living in a decent situation. Right now, we would like to present the results of the survey we conducted over 4 days. We tried to reach out to as many Syrians as possible. We were able to reach out to 380 Syrians in the survey. Phil, if you could present the survey. It's a very simple one. Phil, please.
يعني نتائج الاستبيان
The outcomes of the survey are not actually surprising. The Syrians are divided towards the resolution. And of course, this is not a scientific survey, and it did not include taking a sample or sampling, but I tried to reach out to the networks that I know internally and in diaspora. Internally, people say that the resolution is not that the resolution is not actually valid. And then when I went to the Kurdish and the opposition, it was different. But then I had a balance here. So as you can see, Syrians are divided. And as you can see, the people from inside Syria and outside of Syria, they have the same tendency. Next slide, Phil, please. Here we put forward some suggestions and we allowed for options. And of course, 17% constitute the suggestions, but one of the suggestions was that the United Nations should establish a new resolution, and another suggestion was that Russia would accept or would give up some of its gains, and also the green bar. It says that the guaranteeing countries like Russia, Iran, and Turkey would initiate a new political track. So in the beginning, when we started the voting, we saw that people still wanted the United Nations to take the lead, but later on, we found that they wanted the Russians and the Americans to agree together, 45% of the people. And maybe if we haven't included the 17.2% of suggestions, maybe there would have been more favoring of the United Nations. But right now, people recognize that this is a case of settlement between Russia and the United States, and that Russia is in the capital of Syria, which is Damascus, to negotiate with the United States of America in order to achieve or to reach to a political solution. Next slide, please. Many people wrote to me suggestions. I can share with you this over email, but the best one that I like the best, a person told me I am one of the old generations that believes in the people right to self-determination. So this is exactly what we are looking for. We want the Syrian people to have the right to self-determination, and they should have the right to decide on their political future, and not the international community. Thank you very much, Phil. Let us look at the reasons that led us to ask about the validity of the UN resolution or not, is by looking at the political scene. When this UN resolution was established in 2015, the armed opposition was in Daria and Ain al-Fijan and was around Damascus. In Daria specifically, I attended Riyadh Conference 1. There were groups that were actually saying that we reject this, and they were using the force of the weapon. The opposition was very strong at that time. However, the Astana track had uh, weakened this opposition. I'm not saying I agree with this or disagree, but the political reality shows that they were weakened. Also, the political reality shows that the people inside that are under the ruling of the Syrian regime, they were waiting for the effects of victory, but this never happened, which also created more hardships, especially in light of the economic crisis, and pushed people to perceive the issue from a different perspective. Our colleague from Idlib, they are not all terrorists. There are Syrians who are living in very difficult situations, and they are also concerned of the future. Idlib case, for example, which is also an international balancing issue as well. As an activist in women issues, I had to withdraw 2 years ago from the consultation council because I was against the mechanisms or the practices taking place inside of the civil society chamber and also the council, and I believe that they would not lead to anything. For all the participants, ladies and gentlemen, please, if you have any questions, please write it on the chat, and we also have sent you a link again. So if you have any questions, please write it down. I will start here with the question by Mr. Samir Al-Hawash, uh, addressed to Dr. Samira Ambaid. You mentioned the sectarian ruling or governance. Do you believe that in Syria the government is an Alawi one or a dictatorship? Also, there is a question said that Dr. Samira spoke about the vast majority of the Syrian people, and that we would expect the civil society to speak on behalf of the whole Syrian people. Dr. Samira, please answer. Thank you very much, Dr. Muna. What I've mentioned about the sectarian governance or ruling is what was mentioned in Resolution 2254, that one of the strengths one of the strengths of this resolution, that it says that there should be a non-sectarian governance, and there were two main points that have actually affected the formation of this resolution, which is a non-sectarian ruling. The first factor is the presence of ISIS that have taken over a vast territories, and also the other demands that called for establishing an Islamic State. Of course, this affected the Syrians and affected the region and also internationally. The second factor which led to forming this expression, which is non-sectarian ruling or governance, is that there were many crimes committed, many sectarian crimes and atrocities committed, However, in order to answer the question, in Syria, the governance is actually totalitarian regime, and it is based on segregating and creating problems between Syrians, and we have seen this in the recent years, and this is due to the problems steerings or and this is due to the lack of full respect of the Syrian people rights regardless of the ethnicity or religion or belief. Thank you very much, Dr. Samira. We have a question for Dr. Ammar. Since the beginning of the political process, we have seen the lack of sincerity by the parties, and this is because each party is actually associated or linked to a regional power. And according to the statements of the UN envoy, that is the regime that is hindering this political process. So right now, do we have to look for a new UN resolution that might meet the expectations of many Syrians that are not represented in the opposition and the regime, especially from the northern Syria, in addition to the Syrian authority that represents the main party in the conflict? This is a question by Mr. Fahd Assaid. We do not hear you, Mr. Ammar.
لا تؤاخذوني عذرا. شكرا للسيد فهد على سؤاله.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fahd, for the question.
هلا أنا ما راح أقدر أجاوب على السؤال
I cannot actually answer the question
أول شيء بالنسبة للاستحقاق الرئاسي
in a manner that would meet his expectations regarding the presidential
العملية ماشية شفنا انتخابات مجلس الشعب
elections. It is actually a clock that runs in Syria automatically. So everything in Syria is happening on time, regardless of anything else happening, whether it is in relation to the crisis internally or externally.
أنا بحب استغل هالسؤال
I would like to take the opportunity of this question to address a point that was mentioned by several speakers.
القضية الأساسية هي
The main issue is that we, the Syrians, we do not have consensus regarding the definition of a political solution. Now, Dr. Samira mentioned that the totalitarian regime currently in Syria is actually instilling problems between people, but this is something that we do not agree upon. Maybe the main factor behind the crisis in Syria is inherited since we were separated from the Ottoman Empire. So there is disagreement among people. Totalitarian regimes are all over the Middle East. We are not an exception in Syria. The Syrian regime or the current governance, which was established in 1963 or in 58, in 1958, is the first class revolution that took place in Syria. And of course, the lower class revolted against the high class with a specific objective, and under which many Syrian categories have joined. So I think that there is a disagreement between the Syrian people in relation to the UN Resolution 2254. And this is an entry to what I want to say. It talks about, I'm sorry, it says in reference to Geneva Declaration, a transitional governing body with full executive authority or power shall be formed on the basis of mutual consent, meaning it should be based or formed based on the social mutual consent. But mutual consent is between whom? Maybe the main interpretation problem or interpretative problem is that it is interpreted as between the opposition and the regime. But I believe that mutual consent should be interpreted to be among people. Let me go back to the to the idea or the notion that Mr. Ruqman said that the state should be pluralized and should have all the components, but this is again not agreed upon between the Syrians. So this is what we need. We need to sit together. And of course, the suggestion by Dr. Sami uh, isn't what we are seeing in Geneva today something. It is something specific. Some people might agree with it, some other people might disagree with it, and maybe we also need personal initiatives as Syrian people representing maybe specific groups or interest groups. We can have a conference because we need something that is beyond the United Nations scope or the current structures. So this could start with an individual initiative, regardless of who should start or who's representing, and regardless of the supporting countries. Going back to Mr. Fahid, I apologize that maybe I cannot actually answer your question as you would expect. Right now, I am conveying to you the opinion of people living inside Syria, and I might disagree a little bit with Dr. Sami, is that we represent more than 52%. It is not because we prefer one party to the other, but it is the interest. It is the idea that if the regime is toppled, then we are approaching even a worse situation. Those people, it is in their interest, and this is very important, it is in their interest to keep the Syrian state as it is. Everything that they do inside Syria today are sending their children to the military. Why? Why aren't they rising up? Because for them, keeping the Syrian state in place is protection of their interests and protection of themselves. So for these people, it is in their interest for all of these processes to go through without any interference or intervention. But now, within the opposition, they say that there is an American-Russian tendency that we need to come up with a resolution because this will be reflected on the elections. I would say that this is completely false. The Constitutional Committee or any agreement between the Syrians, whenever there is an outcome, a positive outcome, it will be reflected on the internal process in Syria. If it happens now, then it will be reflected if it's 6 months, but these processes will not be ceased. Thank you very much. If any of the participants would like to speak or to participate, please raise your hand. We have another question for Dr. Sami. Do you agree with me? This is Dr. Jamal Qarasli. He says, do you agree with me that the regime perceives any reform process its devastation, and that's why they are not interested in any peace? Dr. Sami. There is also another question for Dr. Sami. Give me the second question because I don't want to answer the first one. They are asking you about your suggestion about establishing a military council, a professional military council in support of the founding Mothers and Fathers Assembly.
بالأخبار أكثر مما أني فعال في هذا المجال كل ما هناك بأنه يبدو بأنه الوضع
It seems that the security situation in Syria requires having a number of wise militants and professional militants to support any successful political process in the country. Now, selecting or electing such a council is a very sensitive manner, and it requires participation by the United Nations and all of the involved parties. However, such a military council would help in bringing in some stability and support
للعملية السياسية.
for the political process.
هذا يعني حتى الآن يعني أنا قاصر فيما يتعلق بمجلس عسكري باعتباري مدني بامتياز.
Of course, I just made the suggestion, and my knowledge is very limited regarding a military council because I am purely civilian. Regarding your first question,
ما في كثير من الذكاء الدبلوماسي بطبيعة
there isn't much
الحكومة السورية
of diplomatic intelligence in terms of how the Syrian government deals with the negotiation or the constitutional committee. The Syrian regime already has about 60% of support from the constitutional committee, and therefore they could have engaged in this process early on.
أسلوب موروث من أساليب
However, I believe that this is an inherited approach by the old Syrian foreign affairs, which requires negotiating everything, even if someone wants to give you assistance or maybe send you some COVID-19 vaccines, then you have to negotiate to appear as you have gained something. So I believe that it lacks diplomatic smartness. There is a question about the economic situation and the economic sanctions. Can any citizen have a political opinion while he or she is deprived living in the refugee camps or IDP camps? And also, what is your opinion about the international community lack of interest in the northern territory?
يعني بالنسبة لقضية القضية الكردية بشكل عام وقضية شمال
Regarding the Kurdish cause and the northeastern Syria, this is essential.
القوى
It is necessary to engage the social force in the political process.
هذا جزء من شعبنا
Ignoring this category of our people is very risky. It must be taken into account, and we must find solutions. In terms of the effects of hunger, unfortunately, the economic sanctions affect the people directly
برمته ولذلك
and the households directly, and therefore the sanctions are very unfortunate, in my opinion.
أراد أطراف المجتمع الدولي
If the members of the international community want to impose sanctions, they should sanction specific individuals, and this is their right and their political decision. But to create a sanctioning approach that leads to hunger among the people, this is completely unfair and must be countered. We have a question by Ms. Najah for Mr. Luqman. The Kurdish representation is not proportionate to the presence of Kurdish, but there are representatives. How can the United Nations and also the sponsoring countries prohibit the Syrian regime from holding the elections, because the elections would be against the UN Resolution 2254, which establishes a time schedule? So can anyone actually prevent the elections or forbid the Syrian regime from holding the elections? Dr. Ammar said that processes are taking place and they will continue to take place. And indeed, election took place in 2014 and a number of parliamentary elections took place also. And I'm very sure that President Assad will be elected again for 7 years. Can any party actually prevent him from holding such elections? The question is addressed to me. Yes. As long as there are areas under the control of the Syrian regime, then no one can actually prevent him from holding such an election. And we have seen such elections in the parliament, even though that there is an article, an express one, in Resolution 2254, saying that elections should be held according to the new constitutions. However, we have seen several election cycles taking place according to the old constitution. If you could remind me of the second part. You are saying that there isn't sufficient representation of the Kurds in the political process, and this is our topic here, is that the resolution does not include all of the political groups. It is true that there are Kurds, but not all of them. So the question is, how can we actually overcome this challenge? Overcoming this challenge needs international will to restructure the organizations negotiating with the Syrian regime. And this requires to have representation of all of the forces on the ground to be within this mechanism. Even though that we perceive this mechanism to have failed to achieve any outcomes, and it will continue to fail to produce any results if it follows the same articles or the same mechanism that Mr. Demistura said or created. When we say Article 1, then Article 1 supersedes Article 2 and should take priority of it. And this is something that everyone understands. But to come up with an article in the middle of the resolution and to put it in front of the negotiation committee and that they have to negotiate it, this would not lead to any progress or resolution. Again, I repeat, the resolution is in the hands of Syrians. All Syrians need to come together. All of those who believe in democracy, all of those who believe in a political, peaceful solution, all of those who believe in the other opinion, all of those who believe in tolerance, who believe in the other political view, they need to come together, those who tolerate each other, and to have their own free platform to affect all of the international resolutions and decisions, and to influence those who have the destiny of Syria in their hands. So in the northeast of Syria, in the autonomous administration, we insist in the negotiations that we hold in the east of the Euphrates, we always call for a Syrian negotiation and dialogue to have a fast solution to reduce the ambiguities and to reduce also the sacrifices that the Syrian people have offered for the sake of change. I think that the environment is suitable right now, and all of the forces understand that we cannot rely on foreign forces. Thank you very much, Mr. Luqman. There is a question for Ms. Lujain, and there is another question for me after that. The question is, in case of a new mechanism or a new resolution, how can we actually work on increasing women participation in the political process to move from only a consultative role to an active role? What is your recommendation? This is a question asked of me by Dr. Rawan. She's saying, how can we actually activate the role of women in the political process in shaping the future of Syria? Thank you for the question. Of course, what we said prompts us to have a new gender women block, not only to increase the number of women present within the different parties, because increasing the women in quantities, because the parties do not select these women based on their belief in the women causes, but based on only the numbers. So therefore, there should be a separate and independent block that should play this role in all of the areas of the political process, not an increase, but increasing the quantity, the quality.
تركب العملية السياسية ثم تدعى النساء أو تشارك النساء. يجب أن تصمم العملية السياسية بفكر نسائي، بفكر نسوي.
The political process should be designed with a women thinking to be the backbone of the political process, not because I only care about the women rights, but because Syria cannot become a civilized state without the active and effective participation of women. And we have two two forms of participation. There is the participation of feminists who want to have a feminist agenda, and secondly, the women participation. And even if the woman is not a feminist, she must be engaged. She must participate in the development, in the building, and in everything. So, in case of a new resolution, we don't know if there will be a new resolution or not, and we hope that there will be no new wars. But as a lesson learned, I believe that the political process should be designed with the women participation built in. A question for Mr. Sami: do you believe that if there is a new resolution, do you think that it will build upon the current resolution, or it will maybe destroy it or supersede it? I believe that a new resolution would destroy the current resolution. A resolution of establishing the assembly of founding fathers and mothers. I don't believe that there's any other way of creating a political solution to ensure a country of or the rule of law and a civil state and a citizenship state. Any other solutions would only extend the crisis. Allow me also to speak about the role of women. It is very important because the role is not only to maintain the society, because men are either entertaining themselves in meetings like those or entertaining themselves with weapons. But the opposite of that, women have maintained the societal values. But the problem with women until now, the level of political awareness with Syrian women does not allow them easily to take their rightful position, which is half of society. So therefore, the solutions for this problem could be through the women quota. We need to start with 30% quota, which was suggested by the ladies with Demistura. And secondly, which is also very important, is to allow women to take leadership positions in institutions. So therefore, men would start trying to appease the women who lead them, which would also encourage many of the leader women in the country. These are steps taken by the West, not only through the quota, but through allowing women to take leadership positions like CEOs or CFOs in the different institutions, which puts high or very competent women in leadership. They did not say that 30% should be in Demistura women, so it's not Demistura women. No, they are Peterson women. No, they are actually activist women, very important women who are very competent, and they are not associated with anyone. They are independent. The structure of the political process itself did not allow the Syrian society to benefit from the experience of these women. It did not allow for communication between these women and the organizations on the ground. I will give the floor to Khalid because if you want to comment on anything that was presented, and then Samira would like also to comment. We cannot hear you. Thank you very much, Dr. Muna. The initiative suggested by Dr. Sami, and he has been putting this on the table for a long period of time, I believe is a suitable solution, or maybe a model solution to reach a social contract and a rule of law state. However, are the forces that can actually push towards such a solution are interested in a rule of law state? We are talking about the mechanism, but what would be the essence of this process, and where do we want to get? This is absent. There are so many mechanisms that can reach us to or deliver us to this solution, but the will is not there. I would like to make also a quick comment regarding Dr. Ammar statement. no one wants the state to collapse. We need to make the distinction that all of us want to live in a state. No one wants the state to collapse. However, the question to Dr. Ammar, what is the definition of a collapsed state? What is the accurate definition of a collapsing state? How do you perceive it? The issue of the UN resolution, here I remember resolution 242 regarding Palestine. It's been there for 70 years, and then we negotiated for 70 or 80 years, but at the end of the day, no one is implementing the resolution. As Syrians, we don't want to get stuck in this impasse. For Syrians, is peace building in need of a UN resolution, or is it in need of actually the will to establish a civil state and a citizenship state? If there is this will, then the Syrian regime can actually make a great breakthrough, and they can actually abandon or get rid of all the UN resolutions. Right now, the economic situation in Syria is not only in need of lifting the sanctions. If all the sanctions are lifted, then the Syrian government will not be able to even meet the basic needs of the Syrian people. We are also in a financial deficit, so we need an urgent relief program, and also the rebuilding program. We need to be accepted as a part of the international community. We want to be living in a normal state, not an abnormal state. The last question also, let us think about this. If all the processes take place in time, for example, the presidential elections or the parliamentary elections, what would be the problem? The problem is not with the elections themselves, but the concept. What is the state that we are aspiring for? Can we actually expect the results of the elections in one municipality in Syria? Yes, we can actually predict who's going to win. Can we expect who's going to win in the parliamentary elections? Yes, we can we can predict this with accuracy or with precision. So what we need is to build a rule of law state. I believe that any Syrian who believes in this can work towards it, and if we can agree upon it, then we can make a great breakthrough in this track, instead of this track that we have entered into, because we became a state to ensure international balances and regional balances in one way or another. And the least concern of all of these countries involved in Syria is that they are trying to serve their interests, and then after that they can focus on the interests of others, and we have the same right as Syrians. Last word for Dr. Samira, because we are already 22 minutes beyond the timing. Thank you very much for allowing me the time again, Dr. Muna, especially in relation to the question of Ms. Suad in the first part. She reminded me of a very important point. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami, for your suggestions. The answer is in the same question that is asked by Ms. Saad, which talks about the necessity to cling to Resolution 2254, because the gains that you've mentioned, Ms. Saad, and also the loss of some gains theoretically, the gains are only theoretical in lack of political transition. However, in reality, the hardship is all over Syria, whether it is in the territories under the control of the regime or in the other territories. And of course, there are differences in terms of the hardship, but these are very minor differences. We know that there are UN resolutions that have been established for decades, but they haven't been put into implementation. So anyone who is interested in the best interests of Syrians would not want this hardship to continue for many other decades, especially if the regime carries out the elections, and if it rehabilitates and rebuilds itself, and if the negotiations continue without any results for years. And also, as we said, that the Constitutional Committee today is only representing the regime and the opposition. So we need to think about something that does not only include theoretical gains, but actual and tangible gains that would serve the best interests of all Syrians. Thank you very much. There are so many other questions related to the regional countries, but this is not the topic of the session. If you have any questions about the Kurdish reality, I apologize for answering, because we will have another webinar about the eastern region, in addition to launching Syrian negotiations in relation to this issue. So what I can conclude out of all of these discussions is that all Syrians, or at least those who are with us here, perceive national reconciliation as a main pillar to the political solution. This is very important. It is for all of us to sit together. We don't want to have the Syrians of Turkey or the Syrian regime. As a people, let us try to open means for this dialogue. And also in the survey, many people were saying that Russia need to compromise with some of its gains and to agree with the United States for any resolution in the country. So this means that we need to pressure both countries, Washington and Moscow, and to tell them enough is enough. We are worthy of living. All the Syrians, not the political regime and not the opposition, all of us, the Syrians, we need to write to Moscow and to Washington and to tell them enough is enough. We want to raise our children in our country. We want our children to go to school and to learn in Syria. We don't want our children to die in the military, neither in Idlib or anywhere else. We are people that is worthy of living, just like the Russian people, just like the American people. We live in the 21st century, and we deserve to live, and we deserve to live in democracy and with dignity and to have development. This is number one. Number two, Syria is approaching elections, and what Dr. Ammar said is very important. There is the state and there is the authority. All of us do not want the Syrian state to collapse, because we don't want to be a failed state. But in this Syrian authority, is there anyone who is courageous enough to propose national initiatives with some guarantees prior to the presidential elections? Because there are so many Syrians who want to return back to the country, and all of them want a reconciliation. They cannot go to Astana nor to Geneva. They have an opinion, but they want to go back to their country and they want to live decently. So does the Syrian authority have this courage, since Geneva really doesn't care about it? So can the Syrian authority play its rightful role and to be responsible towards its people? This is a very huge question, and I know the answer is very huge, and I will not ask you to answer it. But if we want to build the Syrian state, it is the Syrian state and not the Syrian regime. And there must be some courageous people to take courageous decisions to have actual national reconciliation, and not actually men and women, to remind you. Yes, men and women. The final point that I want to say, the final point in relation to the feminist movement, we, the women, we need to demand to be on the head of that negotiation table, and not to only accept the consultative role or the just an addition. There must be a critical mass in any track, whether it is by the authority or Spain or France, or if Mr. Lukman invites us to Al-Qamishli, any movement should facilitate women participation therein. So I want to ask Dr. Sami. It says that women do not have political awareness, but unfortunately, I think that a person who says that is the one who does not have political awareness. Thank you very much to all of those who remained with us until the end, the 51 participants. Thank you very much for all of your trust. Thank you very much for the 381 people who have responded to the survey. Thank you very much to Dr. Sami, who is my teacher, and he is the father of Syrians. Also, Dr. Samir al-Mubayil, thank you very much for participating. Dr. Ammar, thank you very much. And I hope that all of us would go with you to Damascus. Lujain, thank you very much. Mr. Luqman, thank you very much for your participation. Your participation for us was very important. Mr. Khalid, thank you very much to all of you. Finally, Hibaq, thank you very much for allowing us this opportunity to meet. This will not be the last time. It is the first time, but definitely it is not the last time. There will be more discussions and dialogue about the Syrian situation. Thank you very much. Hibaq, would you like to deliver closing remarks?
Yes, I just would like to thank everyone. And, one of the participants just summed it up beautifully. And she said, this is what she said, a really very cool idea. There will be access to various other opinions outside of the advisory group that often do not reflect all the opinions. And that was Sajjad Nasru. And that's exactly what it is. What we are trying to do in this forum is to make it available for everyone to come and to dialogue, and to also have ordinary people to have access to contribute to the peace agreements, or to have access to those who are participating, Syrians and non-Syrians, the internationals that are participating in these meetings in Geneva or Washington or London or where it is, and to make sure that we hear from them directly, and that the people have access to tell them what their opinion is. So I'm absolutely thrilled that we have started and launched this initiative with Syria. And we would love to hear your opinions on other, gatherings we could do for Syria, and and if it's the Americans or the British or the Russians or anyone else, we will absolutely extend an invitation so that we can hear directly what they are saying, and ordinary people could hear it directly what they are saying. So, like the wonderful participant said, this is a cool way of absolutely taking over from other people who have assigned themselves to be speaking for Syrians. So we want to hear ordinary people and what they think. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the participants, and thank you for making time, and thank you, Muna, for bringing this to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ciao.
مع السلامة.